All right, it's rolling. Okay. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Mark Reynolds. I am the lead gardener here for the Vermi College Collective Gardens. Today we are going to be doing a little video for you folks talking about compost. The video is going to be in 3 sections. First, we're going to talk about what actually is compost. Then we're going to talk about how to do it in an outdoor context. Then we're going to talk about how to do it in an indoor context with worms. That's right, with actual worms. So for now, I would also like to start this video with a quick land acknowledgement. We are on the unceded territory of the Vermi people and other nations of Turtle Island. And I always like to start a video with a little acknowledgement to the fact that this was somebody else's land before we once came here. Now, today, we are going to talk about compost. First of all, let's get into what is compost. It is essentially, I like to think of compost as it's a soil amendment. It's not soil itself. Soil is a mix of clay, sand, organic matter, and then all of the life that goes in it as well. Compost is not necessarily clay in there, there's not necessarily sand in there, but it's a lot of decomposed organic matter. And what compost is it's really the engine that kind of kickstarts your garden. What is in compost that makes it a beneficial thing for the garden? Number one, there's nutrients in there. We're putting in plants that are high in nitrogen, plants that are high in other minerals, and by decomposing them, we're making them accessible for the plants to then use. Now, not only is it the mineral content of compost, but there's also a biological kind of bacterial point of view of compost. The idea being that every plant around its roots, there's colonies of bacteria and fungi that communicate with it, transport nutrients amongst themselves. The plants will secrete sugars that the bacteria then eat, and the bacteria is able to take nitrogen and other such things out of the air and put them into the soil to then feed the plant. It's kind of a beneficial symbiosis. And compost is really like a bacterial and fungal rich medium that we add to our plants to enrich the soil and help them get a boost. Okay, so that's the role of compost. Now, what is it actually made of? There's many different kinds of compost. Nearly every kind of food can biodegrade, and it generally turns into compost, given the right conditions. Now, what are the right conditions for compost? We need a ratio, a balance. I don't know whether any of you at home have Compost Montreal or the city picking up your compost, but I sure do as well. And by the end of the week, my compost bin is a big, slimy, horrible mess. It stinks to high heaven. And this is an example of an unbalanced compost. A good balanced compost won't have a strong smell. It'll kind of smell earthy, a little bit like soil, and we won't have like this kind of rotting food smell. Now, what are the 2 things that we need to balance? Well, there's 3 things really. The first one is humidity. The second one is the level of nitrogen you're adding, which is essentially green material. And then the third one is the level of carbon that you're adding, which is essentially your brown material. Now, a good ratio of compost is 20% nitrogen or greens to 80% carbon or browns. Now, the idea being that nitrogen needs this carbon in order for it to break down. It's kind of like putting 2 things together and having like baking a cake. And if you have too much nitrogen, what's going to happen is your greens are going to start rotting. They're going to get what's called anaerobic, where there's not enough oxygen, and then this rotting smell is going to start happening. It might get slimy in there, and that's a sign of like too much nitrogen or too many greens. If you have too many browns, your compost is going to be dry. It's not going to be very active, and it's just going to kind of sit there like a pile of leaves or whatever else you're using for a very long time and not really break down because there's not enough nitrogen in there to feed the bacteria. So a good mix, 20% greens, 80% browns. Now, when it comes to humidity, this is something that you learn with time. Essentially, a soaking wet compost isn't great because a lot of water means less air. Less air means anaerobic bacteria. Anaerobic bacteria means smelly stuff. Okay, so this is not what we want. And a very dry compost, there's not enough water for the bacteria to survive. It's not actually going to biodegrade as much as we want. Generally speaking, if it hasn't rained, we will spray down our compost pile about once a week. And we'll get in there and turn it, and we'll show you what our compost piles look like in a short while. For now, I'm going to go through some sources of greens that you may have and some sources of browns that you may have. So, greens can be literally any plant material. Here I'm shucking our corn that I harvested today. This is a nice white corn here. And all of these corn husks here and the corn silk is going to make some really good green material. And some other things that you can use that are very common. A lot of folks, like, they kind of bag up their cut grass. Cut grass is a really, really nitrogen-rich green material. We have some cut grass here. And then the other thing is any vegetable peelings, any fruit scraps, things like the stems of broccoli. If you don't want to eat those, you can chop them up here and put them into your compost as a greens. Now, some of the green material you don't want in your compost, generally speaking, citrus peels, so lemons, oranges, limes, take a very long time to biodegrade. They're not from this part of the world, and there's an idea that because they're kind of imported tropical fruits, there's not actually the bacteria in Canada to break down those citrus peels. If we were living in Costa Rica or somewhere like this, then it's not a problem. They decompose very quickly, but in a northern climate, it's not the case because the bacteria just doesn't live here because the fruit doesn't live here. Some other things not to put in, oils. Ideally, we don't want to put any oils. So if you baked something and you got leftover food, like, you don't really want to like scoop out your old, let's say like your leftover poutine or something like this. Like, you don't want to put that in your compost. Speaking of leftover poutine, salty things don't go well. Salt is like death to plants. It can really dry them out and cause like your soil to become infertile. So no salt in your compost. Other such things, dairy is okay to a point. Too much and it's going to get really smelly, so be careful of that. Meat and bones are okay as well, but we do have to keep in mind that bugs and pests might be a problem. So if you start putting meat and bones in your compost, for sure you might have some unwanted guests in the forms of squirrels, raccoons, skunks that are going to come in there and tear open your compost. So generally here we stick to vegetable peelings. We've got a lot of squirrels, a lot of marmots around. We don't want any like unwanted guests in our compost, so we leave the meat and the bones out of it. The city will take meat, bones and oily things as well because they've got so much that it all kind of blends out, and they do it in their own like commercial facilities here. Anything else that shouldn't be composted? Let's see here. I think that's about it for sure. Now, that's your greens. Let's talk about your browns. So in a worst comes to worst, if you don't have anything, scrap paper or cardboard works super well. Just make sure that you take off all of the saran wrap, not the saran wrap, the sellotape from the cardboard there. You don't want bits of plastic in your compost. Same thing goes for fruits. Try and remember to get rid of those little sticky labels. Drives me nuts spending time picking them out of compost. Paper, very easy, accessible source of carbon. Now, in your garden, every year you're going to have a lot of leaves. Leaves are one of the best like compost additives we can use. Very high in carbon, grows all around us. Like, how many of us, bag our leaves to then be picked up by a truck, to then go to a compost facility, to then next year when we want to grow our tomatoes, we buy compost from a store. Like, it's like very open. There's a lot of open loops, whereas if we just kind of keep our own leaves, we can close the loop and keep the soil and the nutrients in our own gardens. So leaves are pretty great. If you have the time, lay them out and run over them with a lawnmower to kind of shred them. If not, don't worry, whole leaves are okay. It just kind of takes a bit more time. And then some other high nitrogen materials, sawdust is okay. Not cedar, because cedar is very antifungal. It's going to take a very long time to break down. And we have here some wood chips, which are again very high in carbon. However, wood chips are quite slow, so don't expect your compost to be ready in about 6 weeks or so. Like this would take about a year or two to really break down. The fastest you can expect compost to be ready to put in your soil, with a lot of like animal manure, for example, which is another green source, very rich in nitrogen, and hay, which is another brown source. Those two together, it'll actually compost within about 6 weeks. And because animal manure is very nitrogen rich, it can actually produce heat at the same time. And if you're interested in checking out something cool, you can look up a video for a compost shower. Literally, you can make water about 70, 80 degrees Celsius using a giant compost pile with pipes running through it, and then you could take a hot shower. It's pretty cool stuff. Now, this is it for making a good balance of compost. We're going to go over now and have a look at our compost pile so you can kind of see it in action as we go along. Here I am standing outside one of our outdoor composts. Now, at the end of the season, we like to keep all of our plant material in the garden. No one comes and takes it away for us. So we have a lot of seeds left behind on these plants. Now, I have made a pile here specifically for the current seedy compost. The idea being that if I used a compost with a lot of seeds left in it and just spread it around my garden, I'm going to end up with all of these weedy seeds growing where I don't necessarily want them to be. So I keep all of the seeds in one place, and then next year, once this is all rotted down and turned into good quality compost, before putting it in my garden, you can put it in a black garbage bin or a black plastic bag to allow the sun to heat it up. Put a bit of water in there, and basically all the weed seeds that are in there are going to be like, oh, it's warm, it's wet, it's time for me to start growing. And because they're in a concealed bag or in a bin there, they're not going to have any sunlight and they're going to die, and then you're eventually going to end up with weed-free compost. It might take a while. I like to shake it around, leave it in the sun from anywhere to 3 to 4 weeks. And I like to use a bin because plastic bags are not so reusable in the sunshine. So yes, needless to say, all of our seedy stuff goes here. Now let's go have a look at the other one. Let's see how this is doing. So this here is our current clean compost. What this means is that any plant material in here comes along without seeds in it. If you want to come have a look in here, it's pretty gross, but it's looking good. Like there's a lot of plant material in here, old carrots someone's left in there, and we can see that turning it around every now and then is really beneficial for the compost. It helps keep the engine rolling and keeps all of the bacteria fed. And then generally we have a pile of wood chips here that we will add to keep the carbon balance nice and healthy. So if you ever come here on campus and you're looking for a place to put your food scraps, you know where to come. Okay, let's get rid of that there. Gross. Now, the last one over here, we have maturing compost. Some folks like to leave their compost for a year to allow those weed seeds to grow. We've just put it under here, and we can see there's a little bit of stuff starting to grow, but generally this is not a lot going on in here. So I would say this is almost ready to go on the garden at the end of the year. It's just a slower way of letting your compost mature, that like you don't want to add any new material. It's just, maybe you have compost which is like halfway there and you just want to leave it alone and get fully digested, as it were. Then you can close your compost and then start a new pile elsewhere and leave this one to finish and do its thing. So let's talk about vermi compost. Vermi means worms, compost means to compost. So here we're talking about using actual red regular worms. Am I saying that right? Red regular worms, yes. A bit of a tongue twister there for you. Let's see, can I find one? Now, vermicompost is something you can easily do indoors, and is something that, again, done right, won't smell, and is a really fun activity. Yeah, look at that. Is a really fun activity. Here's one that I just found. A really fun activity to do with kids who aren't too squirmish, or adults who aren't too squirmish either.
Are you ready?
They
Watch
reproduce every 90 days, so
kidding.
you don't need many here. I've just got, you saw here, this yogurt container was filled with some worms from a sustainability teacher here, and they reproduce every 90 days. and will look after themselves with like very little effort. Now, some things that we want to make a good vermicompost: you'll need a container with a lid. I'm using a bucket here. The blue tubs work quite well as well, and anything that can be sealed that's waterproof. First thing we want is air holes in the top, as well as a handful of drainage holes in the bottom. I already made these just twisting around a knife. The other thing we need as well is, this is a bucket without holes in it to keep any moisture that's left behind here, because we're gonna sometimes add water to this and you don't want it dripping compost worm juice all over your kitchen floor, for example. A good place to keep this is under the sink, or in a back room somewhere in your basement, out of the sun, away from direct heat. Sometimes you'll get flies hanging around, but they'll just hang around, and other insects may move in as well. But honestly, it's not the end of the world. They all help break it down. So here, I've already added my worms in here, and what I'm going to do now, you can kind of see those in there, we're going to make their bedding. So something we can easily use is shredded cardboard or newspaper, and that's slightly damp. I've already moistened this a little bit, like damp to touch. And basically the worms, we want to make bedding that keeps humidity. Like if this soil dries out, the worms will die. So keeping it damp and humid is what we want. And this bedding will also be eaten by the worms slowly and eventually get broken down into vermicompost. Now, some other things we can add to keep our worms happy. These are leaves here, and these are dry leaves. So I'm just gonna wet these here. I got a nice bucket of water there. Just gonna wet them, let it drip off, put those in there. Now, what do worms eat? Bedding, pretty simple. Food, a little bit trickier. There's some things that they really don't like. Citrus is a no, and alliums. So that means your garlic, leek, onion, chives, anything with that kind of oniony smell, that's also a no-no. These are very strong antibacterial, antifungal herbs, and I think it upsets the worms having them in their environment. Some other things to keep in mind: no dairy, no baked goods, no salt, no meat, no bones. We're basically dealing with purely old vegetables, vegetable peelings, fruit peelings, apple cores, banana peels, things like this. For our compost here today, we are using what I was just talking about earlier. So we've got here a nice variety of cut grass, and I'm gonna spend a little bit of time here just kind of cutting it up more for my sake than for the worms. They'll honestly quite happily just munch through an entire whole banana or something like that if you leave it in there. But chopping it up makes it easier when it comes to harvest time. Like harvest time, I mean taking out the compost, because some of this plant material will kind of stay there and you'll end up with stringy compost, which might be a bit difficult. And then old vegetables, here's a zucchini that was rotting in our garden. So I'm just chopping this up here, putting that in there. And then we've got our corn husks here. Now this is a lot of food for them. That's perfectly fine. Like, you can't really overfeed your worms. If you add too much food, it might start getting a bit smelly, it might start getting a bit rotten. But honestly, like, you'll just kind of learn what they eat as time goes by, like in terms of quantity. And adding it in here, I'm gonna just finish cutting this up here. Then I'm just gonna mix it all around. And we'll do some zooming in shots in a bit so folks can see what this looks like. And if you're starting with like just worms, adding 2 or 3 cups of existing soil will really help keep your worms happy, because they enjoy eating grit, like little particles of clay and sand that's found in soil. So if you don't have that in here, just adding in a little bit of soil to, it's how they digest their food. They kind of use it as it passes through their digestive tract to grind the food down. So this looks pretty nice, and I want to keep this a bit more humid than I have it at the moment. Basically, you don't want it to be soaking. Your worms can drown if it's too wet. This is why we have holes in the bottom. But you want it always to be damp to touch. If you ever see the soil drying out on top, that's not a good sign. And you can feed, they say for every 1,000 worms, you feed them a pound of food. Now, how do you count 1,000 worms? I have no idea. Maybe that's a fun activity for some kids on a rainy day. Generally speaking, when it comes to feeding, what I've seen folks do, we're just starting one here, but when it comes to the next time, you kind of feed in a circular pattern. So let's say if it was a clock face, I'm going to put my food at midnight, and then the next bunch of food I'm going to put at 3 p.m. or 3 o'clock. And before I add the new food, I'll look at that midnight section and I'll see how much is left. I'll kind of dig a little bit. If there's a lot of undigested food left, then you know that maybe you don't have to add as much next time, or you can wait a bit more until you add it. And then once I've added my 3 o'clock, next time that feeding comes, I'll put it in a 6 o'clock position, and then I'll double check on the 3 o'clock if there's still food left. I might leave it for a few weeks, or I'll add less next time. And you kind of work in a clockwise pattern. And I know folks sometimes put a little stick so they can remember the last place that they put the food, just to double check on how your worms are doing. When it comes to using the vermicompost, it's very strong. If you put it directly on your plants, it's going to burn the plants. Like, it's very strong in nutrients. This is like superfood for plants. So what you want to do is mix it with other soil or compost, a 1/3 ratio. So 1/3 vermicompost to 2/3 soil or other compost, and then you can use that to feed your plants without risking burning them. And if your worms died, don't panic. You can always start again. Like, this is very low cost, low maintenance. You have to generally spend like once every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, open up the lid, check on them, maybe add some food, maybe add some water. But aside from that, like, these worms really look after themselves. And I think that's about it for vermicompost. Have fun. Okay, that's that.